name is Eliza Kingsford. I am a licensed psychotherapist specializing in body image and eating disorders and obesity, and I'm the executive director of Wellspring.
Hi, my name is Nicole Avena. I am a PhD neuroscientist and author and expert in fields of diet, nutrition, and addiction. I am an assistant professor of pharmacology at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in New York City, and I also do work with Wellspring Camps in a consulting role.
So from our survey results, we found that 40% of adults ages 18 to 34 did not feel like their parents set a good example or give them good guidelines for being healthy with food consumption. We thought that was really interesting and wondered if the emerging science is specific to that age group, 18 to 34, if something has changed to perhaps prevent people from being able to provide guidelines, or if the guidelines or example, I should say, has changed over the years in what parents are doing with food.
Yeah, I think that, that particular age range falls within the range. I'm just outside of that age range, so I feel like I can relate to, the participants in many ways, in that the guidelines that were provided to adults in terms of healthy eating and what we should be feeding our children really haven't been very good. We're only now recently seeing serious discussion, in my opinion, about changing the food intake guidelines, about making changes to how much recommended sugar is consumed each day. And we're also seeing some discussion and debate about changes in nutrition label and making nutrition information, the nutrition facts label, more apparent and more obvious so that people can understand it better. And so I think that by no fault of the parents of those individuals between the ages of 18 and 34, I do believe that there just hasn't been a lot of good information provided for parents to educate their children about healthy eating practices. I also think that we live in a culture now in which mom and dad often both work. There's many opportunities, for us to just simply grab something quick or eating out. And so cooking at home and taking the time to prepare meals at home often falls to the wayside. And I think that the sort of long-term ramifications of that haven't necessarily been taken very seriously until recently, where we're now seeing issues related to obesity. And more importantly, I think it's issues related to behavior change. Mm-hmm. And so when children are exposed to certain types of eating practices that they receive from their family life at home, it's hard to break those habits later in life. And so if you grow up, drinking soda and having dessert every single night, and that becomes a way of life, that becomes the norm. And so it's difficult to make those changes once you become an adult if you start to have medical problems that potentially are related to those behaviors. Right. So I think now we're starting to see a bit of a change in tide in that, we're starting to see recommendations being made by the World Health Organization, for instance, to change the recommended amount of sugar intake that children should be having. And it's a drastic reduction. It's much less than what is currently being consumed and much less than what's, presently available. So I think that over time we should see some additional changes, and hopefully with the next generation, they won't necessarily feel the way that this particular one does.
What do you think, if we're starting to make the changes in the recommendations, and certainly sugar consumption being one of the main focuses, how does that look in the shift? And I guess the question being, when will the business of agriculture and the restaurants and what's available on the shelves, when will we start to see the shift to come back to a more whole foods way of eating, or with less added or processed sugars? In my view, it's going to be a while. Do you think that will happen quicker with these types of recommendations?
Yeah, I think it's all going to boil down to consumer demand. And so the people eating at the restaurants, if they're the ones that are demanding that, the food be more wholesome and not contain so much added sugar, and they're going to refuse to buy it unless those demands are met, then, we're going to see delays in the changes. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's really going to boil down to, as a society, how strong we feel about these recommendations and how much we're willing to put our foot down and take them seriously and expect the people who provide us with food, such as the food manufacturers and restaurants and so on and so forth, to abide by these recommendations. I think, in terms of seeing voluntary recommendations, just being imparted by different groups, I think many restaurants and food manufacturers do want us to stay healthy. They do want to have a healthy food environment for humans to live in. Certainly, we're the consumer, so they want to make sure that we're around to buy this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that, the bottom line does come down to, consumer demand and what the consumer wants. And so if the consumer in all of us is adamant about seeing a healthy diet available to us and our children, that's really going to make the difference, and that's going to be the driving force for change.
And interesting too, isn't it, when we think about the emerging science and food addiction, and if people are really afflicted in that way by highly palatable foods, it's much more complicated than just saying, oh, well, don't buy that, or oh, well, don't eat that. Do you see that population needing treatment and intervention to be able to change behavior?
Yeah, I think, education is certainly key. And I think that we have to remember that in terms of thinking about food addiction, there's a gray area here between food abuse and food addiction. Mm-hmm. I think that individuals who meet the criteria for having a food addiction will probably need some sort of treatment or intervention beyond just being able to stop eating or stop eating those types of foods. Just like with drug addicts, drug addicts or alcoholics often get to a point where they've tried themselves to cut back and it doesn't happen. And so they need to get some professional intervention in order to be able to succeed at being healthy. And I believe the same thing can happen with food addiction as well. But I also think that food abuse really is sort of the preamble to food addiction, in that, many people, I think all of us abuse food at some point or another. And by that I mean, eating way too many pieces of pizza or eating, way too many cookies. We might not be manifesting as having obesity yet or having metabolic syndrome yet, but that is certainly a possibility. Mm-hmm. And so I think certainly education about the dangers of overconsumption of these types of foods leading to food abuse and potentially leading to addiction is definitely critical, and something that we all need to be keeping our thumb on so that we can keep up with the science and learn more about the foods that we eat every day. I think it's very important that, and it's almost perplexing to me that we all eat every single day. We need to eat. And we know very, very little about the long-term effects of what those foods can do to us. And so I think it's, certainly of interest to all Americans to know what is in our food, what is it doing us, and what are the long-term effects of that.
Do you have any sense yet in your research as to why some folks are more susceptible to that abuse or overuse of food than turning to an addiction versus something that does not turn into obesity or turn into problematic behavior?
Yeah, I don't think we're quite there with the research yet. There have been some studies that have been conducted in laboratories that suggest that alleles to certain genes for dopamine are associated with addictive-like behaviors, one of which is addictive-like eating or food addiction. And so it may be that some individuals have a propensity to engage in some sort of addictive-like behavior, and for some people it ends up becoming alcoholism or drug use, but for others it might become food addiction or food use. Also, we've noted in the literature, and this has been seen clinically as well, that people who are not addicted to alcohol or drugs, but maybe previously have been, are often at higher risk for developing obesity or food-related problems. And so that seems to be a risk factor. Having that experience with addiction seems to put some people at especially higher risk for developing problems with obesity and overeating too. So those are people that need to be monitored as well.